Hello and welcome to another lecture. In this lecture, I will discuss moral relativism or ethical relativism. This lecture is based on two papers, two articles that I have published, recently published. One is the incoherence of moral relativism, where I respond to Professor Park's defense of cultural relativism. And the second one is ethical subjectivism, a lost cause, where the conversation continues. So what is ethical relativism or moral relativism? There are two types of relativistic ethics. One is the cultural type, which says that morals, and by morals I mean right, wrong, good, bad, etc. All these moral values and our moral duties, what we ought to do, ought not to do, are relative to a culture. In other words, they are decided by a culture. There's also a type of relativism known as subjectivism. This is similar, but it claims that morals and moral values and duties are relative to a person, to the individual. So to give you an example, take eating beef as a practice. A cultural answer, cultural relativistic answer would be the following. In India, it is not permissible to eat beef. But in the United States, or other parts of the world, it is permissible. Therefore, the morality of eating beef is relative. It depends on the country or the culture where you find yourself in. A subjectivist answer would be, it might be right for me and may be wrong for you, but it's not the same for everyone, because the subjectivist argues that he or she decides what is right and what is wrong. Now, there are certain implications, logical and ethical implications to moral relativism. I think that these implications, the following implications that I will explain, successfully show that moral relativism is false. Let me start with a couple of clarifications. There exist objectively true facts. For example, James Brown is dead. Apples are fruit. The Empire State Building is in Manhattan, or probably I should say on Manhattan. So these are objectively true facts. What do I mean by objective? I mean that they are true no matter what. You may disbelieve these facts, but nonetheless they are true. It is true objectively. There are also subjectively true facts. For example, that apples are the best fruit of all the fruit in the world. That is a subjective statement. James Brown is a great singer, or was a great singer. That could be a subjective statement or judgment. Or the Empire State Building is tall. Well, for some people it might be tall, for others may be short compared to others. So all these are relative or subjective. Now, the question is, what does R stands for relativism, say about any moral act? For example, stealing someone's wallet. Relativism says there's no objective fact, like, for example, the fact that James Brown is dead and the Empire State Building is in Manhattan. No. Relativism says it is wrong But if it is wrong, it is wrong for a culture, a particular culture that says it is wrong. But it might be right for some other culture. Although I don't know any culture that holds such a value that stealing someone's wallet is right, but this is what relativism says. Now, this entails that stealing someone's wallet is right and wrong at the same time. Why? Because if relativism says that there's no ultimate answer, there's no objective fact, but rather, like in the case of the subjective facts, remember, James Brown is a great singer. Is there a way to determine whether that's objectively true? No, because it's a matter of taste. And moral relativists say that moral acts are judged by essentially subjective taste, the subjective taste of a culture. Or in the case of subjectivism, ethical subjectivism, these facts are decided by the subject, the person. So in other words, the bottom line is that according to relativism, stealing is wrong, or any other act is right and wrong at the same time. The problem is that nothing can be and not be at the same time. For example, James Brown cannot be dead and alive at the same time. The Empire State Building cannot be and not be in Manhattan. Apples cannot be and not be fruit at the same time. And because relativism claims that an act is right and wrong at the same time, which leads to absurdity, it must follow that relativism is false. Now, the second argument against relativism. So we all believe, well, not all perhaps, but most sensible people recognize that the Holocaust is immoral, was an immoral act perpetrated by the Nazis. We also recognize that slavery is immoral. But what does relativism say about it? Moral relativism says that moral or immoral depends on the point of view. In other words, a relativist would say that for some people or for some cultures, the Holocaust is immoral and slavery is immoral, but not for other cultures. Okay? Now, if you ask a relativist, but there must be an ultimate right or wrong, and no, that's the very point. Relativists say there's no ultimate way to judge, because how would you prove that the Nazis are wrong or the Americans are wrong, for example? How do you prove it? How do you determine that? Certainly you cannot run a test, scientific test, and demonstrate scientifically that the Nazis did something immoral, or vice versa. Another argument. Those who fought segregation and slavery, which you might call moral reformers, according to relativism, they should be condemned. They are wrong. Why? Because social reformers went and go against the status quo. In other words, they go against their culture's values and morals. Therefore, they are immoral. I think that this shows that the absurdity of moral relativism. Also, moral progress. Now, moral progress, remember that progress can be made only if there's an ideal toward which we are moving, a moral ideal. But relativism denies that ideal. But it is also, in my view at least, impossible to deny that moral progress really happens. Think about a long time ago, there was slavery, well, not too long ago, and nowadays slavery, for the most part, at least in most civilized countries, it has been abolished. What do you call that if not progress, moral progress? And so if moral progress does exist, it follows that relativism is false, because relativism denies moral progress. Now think about it. Abolition of slavery, women's emancipation, animal rights, human rights. What does relativism say about these? Relativism says there's no moral progress. These do not show a progress in morality. The only thing that they show is a change in society. I think that this is absurd, and therefore relativism is false. Another argument against moral relativism is that, according to cultural relativism at least, relativism says that the culture determines the morals, determines right, wrong, good, or bad. Moral subjectivism, on the other hand, says that the individual determines morals. Now, with regard to cultural relativism, what exactly is a culture? When you think about it, the concept of a culture is very vague, because think about it, for example, our own culture, the American culture. We live on the same land, okay, and we call it the United States. And we can say, well, we have a culture. But when you ask about it, on closer inspection, you soon realize that there's no really unifying culture, so to speak. For example, what does our culture, our American U.S. culture, say about abortion? Well, some people are for, some people are against. What does our culture say about cloning? What does our culture say about smoking marijuana? What does our culture say about the death penalty? As you can see, there are people within the same culture that have completely opposite views on morality and morals in general. So what exactly is a culture? And as a matter of fact, if you ask furthermore, in which culture or subculture or group do I belong? You will realize that you belong in many different groups. You might be a student, or an employer, or an employee, or a mother or a father, or a Christian, or a Muslim, or any sort of group that you want to divide. The bottom line is that relativism says that the culture decides the morals, but there's no culture, so to speak. It's only a vague concept, because in every, so to speak, culture, the American culture, the Indian culture, the Italian culture, there are many, many different views, and a lot of these views are totally opposite. So how do you make sense of that? I think it's very vague. Now, with regard to subjectivism, I think it's even more problematic for subjectivism, because if relativism, the cultural type, says that the culture itself determines the morals, well, subjectivism says that the subject himself or herself decides the morals. But when you think about it, how does the subject decide the morals? For example, if you are a moral subjectivist and you argue right and wrong are what I decide they're right or wrong. Now, there's an interesting question about this moral decision. How do you make the decision? Do you think about, for example, abortion? What do I think about abortion? And you come up with a decision. But what causes you to make that decision? Well, perhaps it gets complicated because you will have to either flip a coin or look at reality, look at your culture, go back to your culture, or do some sort of reasoning perhaps, and maybe find a specific and objective reason. But this is not going to work because, remember, subjectivism denies that there's anything objective about morality. So it's a real big mess. Okay, the bottom line is relativism has a problem when it comes to determining who determines what right and wrong are. The next argument is tolerance. It seems that if you are a moral relativist or a moral subjectivist, you say, okay, I think that this such and so is right or wrong, but I perfectly, totally understand that my view is a subjective view, or it's a relative view, and so I cannot say to you that you are wrong, full stop. It might be wrong for you or right for you, and vice versa for me. So, in other words, it seems that relativism implies that tolerance, namely the respect of other people's practices and beliefs, is a moral principle that must be respected. The problem is that tolerance, as such, would be an objective moral principle. But relativism denies objective moral principles. Consequently, if the moral relativist or the subjectivist affirms tolerance, he or she thereby contradicts himself or herself and undermines the very theory of relativism. See? Okay, so in the next few slides, I'm going to explain briefly what the conversation between Professor Park and myself is regarding this. Now, what about the principle of tolerance? Professor Park says a tolerant act is moral in reference to a culture that agrees with it, but immoral in reference to another culture that disagrees with it. So, in other words, Professor Park argues that tolerance is relative. Now, here's my response. First of all, as we have seen earlier, nothing can be and not be at the same time. So, tolerance cannot be moral and immoral at the same time. Well, but of course, Park might reply, well, that's exactly what moral relativism argues. Okay? But my second point is this. Take the statement, tolerance is relative. Now, and ask yourself, is that statement true? If it's true, it shows that some moral principles are objectively true. And this then undermines relativism, which denies the objectivity of moral values. But if it's false, then Professor Park contradicts himself. So you should ask Professor Park, which is it? Which one do you prefer? Now, some moral values are objectively true. This is what I argue. I'll give you two examples. Torturing innocent people for fun is always wrong no matter what. Generosity is good. At least in general, it is good. And virtually all cultures and all individuals hold that generosity is good. But Professor Park says he admits that practically all cultures in the world agree that torturing, for example, innocent people for fun is wrong. However, he says it's possible that all cultures in the world jointly endorse such values. But it doesn't follow that such values are objective. Now, if it doesn't follow that from the fact that all cultures think that these values are right or wrong objectively, what does follow from it? Now, to say that all cultures unanimously or jointly approve generosity and disapprove torturing is either due to accident or social utility, what's best for society, or, as I argue, objectivity. Now, what is the best explanation? Now, think about it. If these values are held by all cultures just by pure accident, it seems that if something is accidental, the opposite must be at least conceivable. But as I argue, it cannot even be conceived a society where torturing innocent people for fun is good. Now, secondly, if it's due to social utility, what's best for society, well, this seems to entail that social unity and what is best for society is an objectively good value to which societies strive and try to attain. But once again, if this is true, then it denies relativism. Now let's talk about social reformers and moral progress. According to Professor Park, moral reformers are right or wrong depending on the moral frame of reference. So from the current culture, Professor Park says, they are right. From past culture, they're wrong. And with regard to moral relativism, or moral progress, Professor Park says that moral progress is relative. So today people say that equality is better than slavery, but during slavery they used to say that slavery was better than equality. Okay, so it depends on the frame of reference. Now, my response is the following. First of all, many people in the past rationally recognized that moral reformers were right. They were doing the right thing in going against the status quo. So it is not true that all people back then believed that social reformers were wrong. Furthermore, the second point is, what exactly are the past and the present cultures? Are they not the same culture? Don't we say that it is the culture, the same culture, just different people, of course, but it's the same culture that undergoes a moral evolution. But if you insist that there is a past culture and a present culture, I would ask you to tell me, where does the old culture and the new begin? Now, it seems to me that it's more plausible to say that the same culture evolved morally. Same culture underwent moral progress. So the best explanation is that humanity is becoming increasingly liberal because liberalism is an objectively good standard of morality. Now, the next contention is if you remember, that the concept of culture is vague. But Professor Park says that any number of people is sufficient to make a culture. Now, my response is the following. Can we really believe that one or two people can form a culture? But who makes this decision? It seems to me that when one or two or three or four people claim to be a culture, or an individual claims that something is right or wrong according to him or her, we just stop listening. We don't take that seriously. Because at the very least, this does not show that morality is relative. It only shows that some people think that they can make their own morality. Now, Professor Park has an interesting example in his first paper. He says, suppose that a hypothetical person, we call him Mary, is an American citizen and Christian who contemplates abortion. The American law condones it. Well, not anymore. But Christianity prohibits it. Well, there are problems already with these statements because the American law doesn't condone abortion, and Christianity certainly does not completely prohibit it. As a matter of fact, many Christians perform abortions. Now, Professor Park, in any case, says Mary's abortion is moral in relation to the American culture, but is immoral in relation to the Christian culture. This is what he says on page 165. Now, the problem is that assuming that Mary is a cultural relativist, now, which principles or principle of her culture or her society should she follow? Now, there are, as I pointed out, there are many people in the American culture who are for abortion, others who are against abortion. Furthermore, considering that the majority of religion, the main religion in the United States is Christianity, accordingly, 70.6%, more than 70% of Americans are Christians. Wouldn't Mary's interest in her future as an American, listening to the American culture, involve being a good Christian? So if Christianity is part of a culture, then what is Professor Park talking about? How the bottom line is, suppose that Mary is a subjectivist or a relativist. How can she make the decision? If she's a cultural relativism and she asks the culture for values, the culture is going to have many different values. And if she's a subjectivist, she's going to have to ask herself. So if she doesn't yet know whether it's right or wrong to perform an abortion, to get an abortion, how is she going to know if she's a subjectivist? The idea is that the subjectivist decides what is right and what is wrong. So Mary would have to ask herself, hey, Mary, is abortion right for me or not? I don't know. Who knows? Well, the subjectivists know, but according to subjectivism, the right decision is made by the subject. But how can Mary make a decision when she knows nothing about abortion? She doesn't know what to do. It's very complicated. Now, let me talk about the last nail in the coffin. I think that this is I left it for last because I didn't want to spoil your appetite or your surprise. This argument is the nail in the coffin of moral relativism. Ask a cultural relativist or a subjectivist the following question: is relativism true? Or is subjectivism true? It seems that the honest answer must be the following: no, relativism or subjectivism is not true. And I think I rest my case. Now think about why. The moral relativist or the subjectivist cannot say, yes, subjectivism is true. Because what does she mean by, or he means by true? He or she means that subjectivism or relativism is objectively true. But this is something denied by the very theory of subjectivism or relativism. So if the subjectivist or relativist is honest and he answers no, then relativism is not true by definition. What if the subjectivist says, well, it's relative? But then if he or she says it's relative, it means that it's not objectively true. So it means that it could be true, it could be false, depending on the person, which leads to the conclusion that different people think that they can decide their moral values. But it doesn't show that relativism is true. Okay? All right. So, in conclusion, moral relativism is an appealing theory, but in my view, as I have at least tried to show, it is incoherent, internally incoherent. Why? One, it asserts that something can be and not be at the same time, which is absurd. It asserts that slavery, murder, and any other acts are not ultimately wrong or ultimately right. 3, moral reformers are immoral and should be condemned. This is absurd. 4, moral progress does not exist when it just flies in the face of reason. It obviously exists. 5, right and wrong are up to the culture. But the culture is a vague concept. 6, tolerance does not exist. 7, unanimously accepted values are accidental, or they're just a mystery, according to relativism. 8, relativism fails to give guidance, because when you ask yourself, okay, which way should I go? What moral decision should I make? Relativism says, go with the value or duty relative to your culture. But then you discover that your culture has many different views on the same matter. So it is very confusing at best. 9, finally, if it is true, it is false. Okay, this is the end of the lecture. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. Feel free to go back to the slides. Feel free to contact me and ask me all the questions that you want, please. And in the meantime, I wish you a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time in the next lecture. Goodbye.